Today's episode is sponsored by Trading 212, the platform bringing commission-free investing to everyone. Welcome to Many Happy Returns, where we aim to make you a better investor. I'm Roman.
And I'm Michael.
On paper, your net worth is simple: assets minus liabilities. But what counts as an asset? How do you value things you can't easily sell? And is the final number even a useful measure of your financial health?
We dig into the nuances of tracking your net worth and what it does and doesn't tell you. And in today's dumb question of the week, how much do I need to be rich? All right, let's get into it. So today we're going to be talking about measuring your net worth. Now, we've probably all got a spreadsheet tucked away somewhere on our computer, the last open date in 2023, and we're like, oh my goodness, I should really update my financial tracker and look at what my personal balance sheet is. But how do you do that? There's lots of different ways. Lots of people have different opinions. Today, I think we should look at some of the controversial questions and give our opinion on what should and shouldn't be in your net worth calculation and how you put a value on some of these tricky assets. So first up, Roman, should you include your home in your net worth?
Well, certainly wealth managers don't include it. So to calculate your net wealth, they'd exclude your primary residence and they'd include any investment properties, i.e. these are homes that you don't live in, but which you essentially have as assets. The house you live in is usually seen as a liability, which as homeowners, you'll realise is probably valid given how much they cost to run.
Oh my goodness, Roman, we're going to disagree right at the top here. Because I think your home should definitely be included in your net worth calculation and the associated mortgage debt if you have one. Primarily because it's the biggest asset most people own. Like, keeping it off your balance sheet doesn't make much sense to me. You just got to make sure you value it fairly.
Yeah, I guess from the point of a wealth manager, it's different from an individual. So I'm not saying that's the way we should look at it, but it's certainly the way wealth managers look at it.
I mean, I get your point that it's not bringing in an income. It's not that kind of asset. Although it kind of is. If you're thinking about imputed rent, you've got to live somewhere. You're going to be paying rent. And you're effectively paying rent to yourself if you own a home. Anyway, let's put all that economic discussion aside and just say, I think you should include your home. And if you are going to include your home on your spreadsheet, how do you value it?
Now, this is tricky because it's not like the stock market when you can look at the price of a stock second by second. In this market, you only observe the price every 5, 10, sometimes decades apart. So really, there are models now that help you do that. For example, if you go to Rightmove, it might have a guess at what your property's worth based on its size, location, and attributes. But it is just a guess. And I think that's the primary difficulty with valuing your home.
They are all unique, aren't they, really? You don't know about how it's been decorated, the state of repair of the building, whether someone died in the basement. There's all sorts of things that are unique to your house.
And crazy neighbours, you just have to be lucky with this stuff sometimes. You never find out what the neighbours are like until you move in, and we've been really lucky, I have to say.
They listen to this podcast, don't they, Roman?
I don't think they do, actually.
They're not nice.
I don't think they do.
So yeah, I guess you can go down this kind of guesstimate route with these online tools like Zoopla or Rightmove. You could also ask an estate agent to value your property. You're probably doing that if you're actually going to sell it. However you come up with that number, are you just going to bung that straight into your spreadsheet? Or are you going to take off the potential transaction costs? Because when we think about what are we trying to track with net worth, like we said at the top, it's assets minus liabilities. It's kind of how much would you have left if you sold all your assets for cash and paid off the debt? Now, if you're going to sell your house for cash, that has a cost involved.
Personally, I think you should because it's realisable wealth. In other words, if you did sell stuff and pay off your debt, how much would be left over? And if you don't include transaction costs, that would be an unrealistic estimate, I think.
And particularly for your house where the transaction costs are significant, they're going to be a few percent at least. It's different for your stock portfolio, isn't it, where you can sell it very cheaply?
Yeah, you might consider things like if it's in a general investment account and you sold it, you'd have to consider the taxes there. But generally, if you've got stocks, they're so cheap to sell nowadays on most platforms. Often it's almost free.
Okay, let's look at another controversial asset. What about cars and vehicles? Are we including these in our spreadsheet for net worth?
I think you should. And if you look at overall household wealth, you'd include physical wealth. So that would be things like cars, jewellery, furniture, anything which has lots of value.
I guess the crucial thing again is getting the price right. It's not the price you bought the car for.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the classic ones is a stamp collection. You know, if you've got really valuable stamps, how much are they worth? And people have got surprisingly good ideas about that because that is a quite actively traded market.
I guess for high value items, you probably need a professional valuation. And I would argue if it's not a high value item, then there's no point in including it anyway. And going back to cars, I don't own a car. I haven't in a long time, but I understand there are online tools. Is it Auto Trader where you can get a value? I know nothing about cars, Roman. You'll have to take it from me.
Yeah, that's right. You can get an estimate for it. And there are websites also that tell you how much your car is worth. The good one, which is always useful if you're going to sell your car, is webuyanycar.com because they give you a kind of lower estimate of how much your car's worth.
You basically want to put in the depreciated current value, the resale value of your car.
And they depreciate fast, particularly in the early years. That's why it usually makes sense to buy a second-hand car.
And in terms of the collectibles you mentioned, whether that's stamp collections, art, wine, watches, all of that stuff, if it's worth a lot of money, then you probably should put it in there, especially if you see it as an investment. But I think there's a rule here which I would follow. If you wouldn't or couldn't sell it, then it shouldn't be in your spreadsheet. It's not part of your net worth.
Yeah, that's fair because it's all about liquidation. Can you sell it? And if so, there's probably some way of valuing it if that's the case. For example, Teddy, during the pandemic, Cockapoos soared in value. And I was just looking at him thinking, well, I love you, but, you know.
Yeah, but that's the point, isn't it? You wouldn't sell Teddy, I don't think, unless the value really soared. So you probably shouldn't include him as a valuable asset.
Oh, no, I'd sell my kidneys first.
Put the kidneys in there then. Let's move on to pensions, because obviously you should include your pensions. That's not up for debate. But valuing them can be tricky. Let's start with what in the UK we call defined contribution pensions, where it's a little bit more straightforward because you have a pot. It's your pot. You choose what it's invested in, and you'll be able to tap into that when you retire. So you do have a current value of the pot, which you can put into your spreadsheet. But remember, this money is pre-tax. When you draw on it, you will have to pay some taxes. So the question is, do you put in the pre-tax value, i.e. what your pension provider is telling you the pot is, or do you try and do some sort of calculation to work out a post-tax value?
If I was working it out for myself, I probably would work out the post-tax value, the net value. And the difficulty there is you don't know exactly what tax rate you'll be paying in retirement. Obviously, you have control over that. But tax laws can change, the thresholds can change, so you can't truly know what tax you'll be paying, but you can have a fairly good stab at it.
If we wanted to be really consistent, I guess we would put in the full value pre-tax of the pension pot as an asset, and that future tax liability would be included as some kind of present value of debt. But anyway, if you wanted to put in the post-tax value, maybe a simple estimation in the UK could be take 25% of the pot as tax-free, so you don't have to adjust that. And then for the rest, the other 75%, maybe mark it down by the basic rate of tax, which is 20% at the moment. I don't know. I think all this is a bit of a false precision for the reasons you say. Maybe it's best to just bung in the whole pot. But then it isn't equivalent to an ISA, so you're comparing apples and oranges.
Now, certainly for the purpose of my divorce, we needed to get a current estimate of the value of the pensions. So that's something which is doable. But what shocked me is the cost of trying to get that estimate is unbelievably high.
Anytime you need an official number, you're going to be paying for it.
Yeah, you get one freebie, and then if you need another estimate, if there's a big period that lapses between the time you get the estimate and then if it needs to be refreshed, it can be very expensive. Actuaries, I guess, are very skilled people, and their time's very valuable.
And I think it gets a bit more complicated when you think about defined benefit pensions, because they don't really have a market price as such. There's not a pot there with your name on it. So if you were trying to value that for the purposes of a net worth spreadsheet, there are a few ways you could consider doing it. One would be thinking about if you were to transfer your defined benefit pension to a defined contribution scheme. I'm not saying you should do that, but if you were to do that, then there would be something called the cash equivalent transfer value, and you can get a formal quote from your pension provider. And that'll give you like an equivalent value for your defined benefit scheme.
Yeah, and that's what we needed for the divorce. It was the CETV. But it depends on lots of wacky variables, many of which are not predictable. So, for example, you have to think about the risk-free rate, the discount rate as it's called. because the higher the discount rate, the lower the value of the future cash flows.
Yeah, so what we actually saw is as interest rates have shot up in recent years, these transfer values of pensions have dropped significantly, by almost 50% in some cases. So the average cash equivalent transfer value in 2021 was around £270,000. The average in April this year was £136,000. So yeah, almost a halving.
That is a shocking change, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's why I think if you're tracking this as part of your net worth, it's a little bit of a fiction because nothing's really changed. You're still going to get those same cash flows in future. It's just the present value's been changed because interest rates have changed. So you're going to have this kind of, in my mind, artificial volatility in your net worth, even though you've done nothing differently. So I guess it depends on the purpose for which you're building this spreadsheet. And that's maybe something we can come on to later. Because really, if you're keeping your defined benefit pension until retirement, the present value is a little bit irrelevant. It's more of a cash flow tool in the future.
Yeah, and don't be put off about your DB pension because of this crazy change in the valuation. They're incredibly useful later on in life because they are usually linked to inflation and they're not linked to fluctuations in the stock market, which is really refreshing in retirement. It's really valuable to have. So don't cash in your DB pension without thinking really carefully about it.
And you probably won't be able to without getting official financial advice and having a financial advisor sign off on it and say, yes, you can move this pension, to stop people making mistakes. Perhaps a better way of putting a defined benefit pension into your net worth is to not look at this cash transfer value, which is extremely volatile. Maybe what you could do is look at what you've already contributed to your defined benefit pension, and that will give you an entitlement to a certain annual cash flow payment in retirement. Take whatever that payment is, and then multiply it by maybe 20 or 25 times to give you a number to put into your net worth calculation. And this is actually how it worked when there used to be the lifetime allowance from HMRC of how much you could build up in your pension. They had to have a way of valuing defined benefit pensions. And I believe it used this 20 times multiple as a way to calculate how much it was worth for the purposes of the lifetime allowance.
So let's say you've got an income due at retirement of 30K every year, and there's a lump sum of 150K. You'd work out 30,000 times 20, so that's your 20 times multiple. You'd add back your 150K, and you come up with 750K. So is that my wealth contribution from the DB pension?
Yeah, I don't have a DB pension because I'm unfortunately
young,
relatively young. I'd say I'm middle-aged now, Roman. It's tough, but I don't have a DB pension. But if I did, I think I would look at it in this way for the purposes of net worth rather than the volatile cash transfer value. While we're on the subject of pensions, let's briefly mention the state pension. If you're thinking about bunging this into your net worth spreadsheet, I would caution against it.
And again, it's not to say that it's not valuable. It is incredibly valuable, like a DB pension. And if you look at cash flow projections, for most people in the UK, the state pension actually helps a lot. Now, of course, it's not transferable on death. And you really see that if you're a couple and you model the death of one partner. That completely changes the situation. Usually you have to draw much more heavily on the SIP, the ISAs, once that occurs.
Yeah, the state pension is incredibly helpful, but it's not part of your net worth in my mind. Like you say, you can't transfer it, you can't liquidate it. Whereas with a DB pension, you could, if you wanted to, transfer it to a defined contribution pension, and then it's, a pot which can be immediately liquidated upon retirement age. And also the rules change around the state pension.
It's a question about whether there's going to be a triple lock or when it's going to stop, because it is incredibly generous at the moment and becoming increasingly costly for a government which has very few resources from which to pay the ever-mounting liabilities.
Yeah. So I say once you get close to retirement age, factor the state pension into your retirement plan, but it's not part of your net worth.
It's funny, some people are so extreme about this. They actually say, I'm not including the state pension in my future cash flow modelling at all, which is pretty extreme. I very much doubt that a politician is going to scrap the pension altogether.
What we should do from a market solutions point of view here is open up a sort of exchange where I can bet that state pension is still going to exist. I'll pay you 70 pence on the pound to receive your state pension if it still exists when it gets there.
Oh, interesting. I wonder why there isn't such a product because, economically, you'd have thought it would be worthwhile
It's not transferable. The government's still going to pay it to the holder.
Yeah.
But while we're on the topic of state pensions and benefits and all that, what about student loans? Should that go into your liabilities column? Other debts do.
I don't know what people think about student loans. I mean, some people I speak to, they say, look, I could just walk away from it. They're not going to chase me down. Speaking to your friends, I mean, I was from the age before student debt because we actually had grants. But how does it work for you and your friends?
Well, I fortunately paid mine off, but I don't see how you can run away from it unless you go abroad. And even then you owe the money. You're just dodging tax, right? If you don't report it. If you're in the UK, it just gets taken out of your wages under PAYE.
Oh, is that right? It's actually taken out before you get paid.
Yeah, like 9% off the top if you got one of these modern student loans.
I didn't know that. That's awful.
Well, government wants its money back and it's not going to get all its money back. So for me, student loans should be included as a liability. It is a debt. It gets wiped after a certain number of years, so you might not pay it back in entirety.
And if you don't earn, you don't have to pay it back. Is that right? If you never make a critical level of income?
Yeah, it's a very funny kind of debt. It's sort of halfway between a debt and a graduate tax. And there are earnings thresholds and it doesn't affect your credit score and it can't send you bankrupt, all that kind of stuff. If you're applying for a mortgage, they'll ask you about it.
But it sounds like you should definitely include it in the liability side of your balance sheet.
Yeah, I would. And then if you get to the age where it gets wiped and you haven't paid it off, then you get a sudden boost in net worth.
Woohoo!
But obviously you've got to include all your other debts, mortgages, ongoing credit card debt, all that kind of stuff.
Car loans, a lot of people have those.
Yeah, everything. The whole point of this exercise of tracking your net worth is to get a complete picture of your finances as they currently stand. It does get tricky, I guess, on the asset side of things when you, let's say you own a small business and you want to include the value of your ownership there, the equity. But again, putting a number on that is not easy.
I think the way people usually do it is to calculate it based on a multiple of your business earnings. So you might use, I don't know, a 6 times multiple of your annual profit. And that would be the rough value if you sell the company. But of course, if it's a small company, then what value does it have without you? And that could be a real problem if you try to value things that way.
Yeah, you really want the price someone will pay for the business. But as you say, it's not easy. I guess you just have to take your best stab at it. But don't make the mistake of putting company debts as a personal liability in your spreadsheet. Unless you're maybe a guarantor for them, then again, it gets complicated.
Which is unusual. I think most people wouldn't do that, would they?
I think in small businesses, it's not unusual to be a guarantor.
Really?
Yeah. Now, before we go to the break, a couple of last nuances to discuss. Foreign currency assets. I suspect a lot of people listening to this podcast will not have all their assets in sterling or wherever they live. They might own a property abroad. They might have investments in foreign currencies. They might have crypto. How would you approach putting this into a spreadsheet where you've got assets in different currencies?
I often come across this because I speak to, obviously, a lot of high net worth clients. And often it's a difficult question because they don't know where they're going to end up living. So I usually say, which currency do you eat the most? Where do you spend the most and where are you planning to end up? Those questions, if they can answer them, and often they can't, but if they can answer them, then that's their numeraire. That's the currency that we usually consider. And it can make a big difference. For example, if you're looking at inflation, it varies widely based on country and currency.
I think that's the right approach, though. You've got to pick a base currency, in a way, for your spreadsheet. And then every time you come to update it, you've got to look at the assets which aren't in that base currency, get the value, and then convert it back into sterling, if that's your currency, at the current spot rate.
I was speaking to someone from Hong Kong recently, and it's not easy because we were talking about the peg. So the Hong Kong dollar's pegged to the US dollar. And the question is the peg going to break? And he was adamant that it wasn't going to break. I'm not so sure. So if it did break, that could be a huge change in the fluctuations of the currency itself. Because suddenly it becomes tied to the Chinese renminbi rather than the US dollar. So all of these considerations go into your estimates, and it simply complicates the calculation.
I sometimes wonder about the situation for someone who, let's say they live in the UK at the moment, their living costs and their spending is in sterling, obviously, but they plan maybe to go and retire abroad, which is when they'll be drawing on this pot of money, and then maybe their spending currency will be euros. You can argue back and forth about whether it's best to track in sterling or in euros currently in that situation.
Yeah, it's never clear cut. One way you could do it is just look at the fraction which you're spending in each currency. So if you're maintaining a house in New York, a house in London, then the question is what proportion of your liabilities are going to be in each country and how much are you spending in each country? Very complex.
Yeah, I think it matters less what you're spending in now. It's more what you're going to be spending in when you're drawing on your investments.
Yeah, that's true. So that's why I always say, where are you going to end up? And sometimes they just have no idea. You know, they live in Australia. They're originally from the UK. Their kids have probably been raised in Australia, but then they're thinking about moving to the UK. You know, it's never easy. And of course, once your kids have kids, you want to be around, you know, as a grandparent to see the kids. So you've got to be local. Otherwise, it means loads of flights.
Yeah, we have this exact problem, Roman. My wife is Austrian. I'm British. We live in London, but, you know, maybe one day we won't. Maybe one day we'll move to Europe. My wife does own some assets valued in euros, based in Europe. And every month, which is how often we do the spreadsheet, we come and we get the spot rate from the same source every time, consistent rate, convert it all into sterling at the moment because I'm winning the argument about where we're going to live. But I wouldn't bet on that forever. So yeah, it's a tricky thing. But one thing we do in addition, which I think is a good thing if you're in this situation, is to also track your net worth using constant currency. So you basically pick a fixed currency exchange rate, let's say 1.1 for pounds to euros, or whatever the average is over the last couple of years. And you always use that in a separate tab. And then you can track the actual changes in your net worth, which is useful for assessing return and the performance of your portfolios and things like that. Otherwise, it might just be swamped in the short term by FX moves.
Yeah, again, I think the fact that currencies don't drift a lot long term is going to help you here. And this would favour this approach of looking at the long-term average of the currency exchange rate.
Yeah, we just do it to disentangle how we're actually doing from how the pound is doing, right? But I guess a related question I kind of hinted at there is joint assets, where you might own things or owe things together, and how you account for that. Are you doing one spreadsheet for your household? Are you doing individual ones? What do you think?
Well, you know, someone who's got divorced, I think it's worthwhile thinking what would happen if you split the assets. It's not pleasant to look at it that way, but look, you don't know what's going to happen in the relationship in future.
I think the key is in the UK, at least, you're taxed as individuals. So it makes sense to maintain a picture of your individual financial situation. But then I think it is worth squashing that all together in your tracker to see where you are as a household. Partly for the reason that your liabilities are probably going to be as a household if you stay together as a couple long term, but also because there are some optimizations you can do in most tax systems, including the UK, in terms of transferring assets between spouses. And yeah, it makes sense to look at it in the round, I think, and work as a team if you can.
Another reason for looking at the separate balance sheets for yourself and your partner is that you can see any imbalances, particularly for the pensions. Now, in retirement, it really makes sense to have roughly equal-sized pensions, and the sooner you can equalise them, the better. Once you reach, the age of 60, it's probably too late to shift a large amount of money. But early on, you can do more about equalising things. It's just much more tax efficient to use your allowances to the max.
Yeah, and it's not just in retirement, actually. It always makes sense to have roughly equal incomes if you can get to that position somehow. Like if you've got income coming from buy-to-lets or whatever. The UK tax system is a progressive tax system, as we said, based on an individual's earnings. So if you've got one person earning 200,000, that's significantly worse from a tax point of view than two individuals earning 100,000 each. And that's true in retirement, like you say, with pensions.
So when we went through mediation, one of the most valuable things was when we had this whiteboard with all of our assets displayed in front of us. We'd never done that before. So that was very useful. It was one of the positive things that came out of the divorce, I think.
Now, I would encourage people not to do a whiteboard just at the time of divorce. Have a spreadsheet as you go. Hope for the best. And maybe we'll come on to some of the practicalities of this after the break.
Today's episode is sponsored by Trading 212, the platform bringing commission-free investing to everyone. Trading 212 Stocks and Shares ISA is the cheapest way to invest, with zero commission and one of the lowest FX fees I could find on the market. Looking to keep things simple, you can easily automate your investing with pies that allow you to rebalance your portfolio at the click of a button. Customers with Invest accounts can also benefit from the Trading 2-on-2 card, which has no FX fees, true interbank rates, and offers 1.5% cashback on all transactions up to £15 per month. Many Happy Returns listeners can claim free fractional shares worth up to £100. Just create and verify a Trading 2-on-2 Invest or Stocks ISA account, make a minimum deposit of £1, and use the promo code RAMIN, RAMIN, within 10 days of signing up, or use the link in the show notes. When investing, your capital is at risk and you may get back less than invested. Past performance doesn't guarantee future results. Pies and Autoinvest is an execution-only service, not investment advice or portfolio management. Automatic investing refers to executing scheduled deposits. You are responsible for all investment and rebalancing decisions. Free shares can be fractional. 2-on-2 cards are issued by Paynetics, which provide all payment services. Trading 2-on-2 provides customer support and user interface. Terms and fees apply.
Okay, so we've discussed a lot of the different things that might go into the net worth calculation, your assets, your liabilities, how to think about all those different things. But why are we even doing this? Why measure your net worth?
Well, I think it's always worth knowing rather than not knowing. Plus, it's really useful if you want to write something like a will, because then you have to list all of your assets. And presumably you have to know some of your liabilities too. So it's not just a theoretical thing. It's not just a thing which is a vanity metric, I don't think. It certainly has practical applications.
Oh yeah, for sure. It can be an ego thing, right? If you do it as a one-off and you're just being really generous with the numbers and you want to go, wow, look at me, I'm worth 3 million or whatever. But the reason I think it's valuable is because it helps you answer really important questions. Like if you're thinking, can I afford this house? It's hard to answer that without a detailed spreadsheet showing a financial picture. Or am I on track for retirement? How much risk am I taking? And even looking backwards, if you're tracking it over time, have I been making good financial decisions? If you don't have the objective picture and the graph in front of you, you're just going to default to your natural optimistic or pessimistic state.
Plus, if you know, you can still do something about it. Whereas if you don't know, then you'll just continue in this state of inaction. So from all these points of view, I think it makes sense to do this. It's painful, but it's worthwhile.
I think you're right that it can encourage action. I think it's a great motivator. If you have this picture of your finances, if you're tracking your net worth and you can see the number going up over time, hopefully, then it might nudge you into better saving habits. It might nudge you to paying off your debt a bit faster. Because it's weirdly satisfying to see the number go up.
If indeed it is going up, and if it is going down, then you can drill into why. And if there is a little bit of financial leakage due to spending too much, you can correct that early on.
You can also run stress tests, I guess. So you could say, oh, here's my picture of my finances today. What if the stock market crashed 50%? You can sort of run a scenario model and say, oh, how would I feel if this was the picture next month? You could look at various FX swings, like what if the pound suddenly sold off? Someone's done another mini budget or something. Those kind of things can be helpful, I reckon. Partly because it stops you doing the wrong thing when you get there, if you've already thought about it.
Yeah, there's no way you can know about your financial resilience unless you know the numbers. So I think we both agree that it's a worthwhile effort coming up with your personal balance sheet. But the other question is how frequently you're going to track it. How often are you going to look? Because if you're doing it every day, that's a problem because it's encouraging the wrong behavior.
Yeah, I think in that situation, you'd get obsessed by short-term fluctuations and little market moves, which is the opposite of what you should do as a long-term investor. But at the other end, if you track it too infrequently, then I think you could sort of drift off course without even noticing. Daily is obviously too much, but I think if you're only doing it every few years, that's too little.
Yeah, an annual review is probably a good idea. And a lot of wealth advisors do that. They do an annual review.
Yeah, I'd say an annual review is the minimum. Maybe if you have a very simple situation and your finances don't change much, an annual review would be fine.
If markets are moving a lot or if inflation's just surged, then perhaps you'd look at doing it more frequently or based on events like those.
Personally, I do it every month with my wife. We sit down, takes us about 15 minutes to go through everything, update the numbers. We like to look at how it's moved over time. We like that number to go up if possible. But I don't know, maybe monthly is it's too frequently. I think you could do it quarterly and you wouldn't lose too much. For me, the sweet spot is monthly or quarterly. I think annual wouldn't quite give me the granularity I need.
Now, for my market stuff, I monitor that every day. But for the total wealth, I hardly look at it at all. I've been very lazy with it.
Yeah, I'm tutting at both those things. You shouldn't be looking at your market stuff every day, and you should be tracking your net worth, Roman. Though I guess you could say quite a lot is reliant on the business, which is hard to value, like we said.
Exactly. We could put a value on it, and we spend so much time working on it. That's what takes up our day. And we don't step back and think, well, how much would it be worth if we sold it? Because we're not considering selling it.
Yeah, so I gave you an out there for why you're doing this bad behavior, not doing the spreadsheet. But if you were going to do it, does it have to be on a spreadsheet? Are there tools that you can use to automate it? Personally, I just use a Google Sheet, I like to build it myself and customize it. And I've got it to a situation where the model's there and I just have to plug the numbers in every month.
Yeah, I'm very much from the spreadsheet point of view because, as you say, it's completely customizable. There are tools out there, many of them which now have AI, of course. My difficulty always is entering the data. That's the painful part of it, which is working out what you've got, what your debts are. It's not actually doing the calculation.
Yeah, a lot of these tools are trying to solve that problem. So there are things like open banking in the UK where it can pull in your bank balances and your credit card balances. It can pull in your investment accounts. Sometimes those links break. Sometimes not every bank or investment platform supports them. And I have seen that some of these tools are now giving you the option to just upload a screenshot of a statement and it'll use AI to populate everything. I guess you got to think about data privacy concerns with some of that stuff. There's obviously a cost involved, usually a subscription fee. Some of them are, hundreds of pounds a year, the really fancy stuff. And there's also the risk that let's say you get reliant on this tool, you're using it for 2 or 3 years, and then it gets discontinued. It'd be annoying to lose everything. Hopefully you'd be able to get your data out in the meantime. So yeah, personally, I haven't been sold yet on using one of these automated tracker systems. Though I do like the idea. I'd like to build it into the spreadsheet where it could pull from APIs for me. But again, the privacy risks there probably outweigh saving 10 minutes every month. But ultimately, however you do it, you probably end up with a number, your net worth. But how relevant is that metric? Are there other metrics maybe we should be looking at instead or alongside this?
Well, certainly as a company, you can look at different measures. For example, you could look at liquid assets, the ones which you can sell very quickly and easily so that you've got cash which you can then spend.
I don't think that's just relevant for companies. Like I have a cell in my spreadsheet, which is liquid net worth. Like if I had to, instantly, how much could I sell by the end of the week? And so obviously that excludes pensions, it excludes property. It's including things like ISAs and investment accounts and bank accounts. But I think that's a very relevant number. You see people who are asset rich and cash poor. The money's all in the house. You don't feel rich often in that situation.
Or the buy-to-let portfolio, which again is very difficult to sell, but can generate a good income and is extremely difficult to sell in a crisis. Because of course, if there's a housing market crash, that's exactly when it becomes much more difficult to sell.
I think people in that situation often tell themselves, well, I could just re-lever up my portfolio, or I could borrow against the assets. But in the situation where there's a big crash and a dislocation in markets, maybe that's not as easy, or maybe you don't get the value you think you will.
So that's probably a good distinction to make. Work out your liquid net wealth. And I think if you look at your investments, it's also good to take stock of your asset allocation. What proportion of your wealth is in different investments? And certain investments are very bond-like. For example, buy-to-let properties do generate a kind of inflation-linked income that lasts forever. So by looking at your assets in the round, you can do this broad classification into bond-like, equity-like, and plug in the growth rates in the future.
The toilet's never broken in my bond portfolio, Roman. It's not that much like a bond, is it? Buy-to-let property? You just mean in terms of modelling the correlation?
Well, looking at the cash flows. If you look at the cash flows, it is bond-like. You have a big capital allocation up front, and then you get this steady stream of income, which is inflation-linked. And then when you sell it, you get a big principal redemption, again, which is inflation-linked. So that's why I probably treat it as a bond.
And both are very reliant on interest rates.
Yeah, that's certainly true.
It's just when you look at some of the Bank of England analysis, and they do compare property to bonds, it's because of that, basically. Interest rates go down, property values go up, same as bonds.
But you can also look at how likely, historically, each of your investments is to beat inflation. Because if you've got too much in assets which don't beat inflation by much, then that can be very eye-opening.
That's another thing worth tracking, I think, is changes to your real net worth over time. Account for inflation in whatever your base currency is. And look at, are you beating it? That number might be going up, but is it going up more than inflation over time?
And this is the shocking graph, right, which I always trot out if I'm doing a UK property video, which is to look at the real value of property over time. And it hasn't increased in the UK for over 2 decades, if you look at it in real terms.
And if you properly factor in costs, transaction costs, stamp duty, all that stuff, a lot of people aren't beating inflation with property. The other thing your net worth calculation might give you is a sense of how much you could sustainably draw from your portfolio. Maybe that's based on something like the 4% rule or your financial independence number, which might be 25 times your annual expenses. So you can look at your spreadsheet and go, well, if I never worked again, maybe I could sustainably draw £25,000 a year. Obviously, it depends on asset allocation and all sorts of other things. But this is the kind of thinking maybe tracking your net worth allows.
Or if you wanted to change your career, if you're a little bit sick of what you're doing and you wanted to transition to something new, and there's going to be a hiatus while you train up in that new field, well, this will tell you whether that's possible. So I think there are a whole bunch of life choices which this would enable you to make decisions about, and also enable you to do, potentially, if the numbers work out.
Now, I think before we wrap up, we should probably just nod at the fact that your financial net worth is not your personal worth, right? It's not how much you're worth as a person.
And yes, if you look at some of these YouTube videos, that seems very much the way people consider it. They show you around their mansion, they show you the Lambos, they show you the jewelry, and it's kind of like wealth porn. And I don't really like that at all. I think that suggests that that's the goal in life, that is the measure of wealth.
But also, these things you mention are not a good indicator of wealth. Those Lamborghinis are probably depreciating fast, like other cars. The house might not be the best asset. And jewelry, I wouldn't even include that in the spreadsheet. Yeah, you got a nice house, but how's your spreadsheet looking?
Plus, again, as I always say, I think the things which make you happy are the most important things. And wealth, the kind of blingy aspect of wealth, for me, just doesn't cut it. That's not what makes me happy.
I don't think it's what makes many people happy. They might think it is. It's easier if it is. If that is what makes you happy, then life is just straightforward, right? You know what you need to aim for. But for most people, I think that's not true.
And I know for our family, the most miserable times when I was a kid was when we were most wealthy. Living in Beverly Hills, we had stacks of cash, but my parents were miserable, I was miserable. It just was not a good time. And a lot of that was caused by the wealth, because once you've got money, it can lead you to kind of behavior which is, just crazy and not probably conducive to happiness.
Yeah, and there are some things tracking your net worth just won't tell you. Like if you're young, a lot of your value is in your future earnings, not in what you've already accumulated, obviously. If you looked at, for example, the present value of all your future pay, that would overwhelm what was in your spreadsheet today. In a way, you could sort of think of it that over your working life, your human capital is slowly converted into financial capital. And if you talk to older people, they'd probably trade some of that financial capital for dialing back the clock a few years.
So I think the danger with putting a number on your wealth and working out your balance sheet is that you equate that with utility. Utility is this concept of how much something benefits you. And I think for wealth, it's diminishing returns. If you're 10 times as rich, you're not going to be 10 times as happy. And there is a point at which you get diminishing returns. That point will be different for different people. You need a critical lower level of wealth, I'd say, in order to be happy. If you're in poverty, it's miserable.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think the value in tracking your net worth is to allow you to maximize the utility from your money. Like if you don't know what your financial picture's like, you might be making bad decisions, yes, financially, but also in your life because you don't know you can do certain things.
So I'd say focus on the goals and then have a plan and work out the numbers to achieve that goal. And it may be that you've got too much, which is a great position to be in which case you can start thinking about gifting stuff to your family or just spending more on yourself.
I think ultimately what you want is to get to a position where you're not worried about the finances. You're not thinking about them. They're just going on in the background, doing their thing. You're earning enough, you've got enough in the bank that you just don't need to worry about it and you can live your life.
One of the benefits of being a member of our community, people tell us, is that this encourages them to act on their financial situation. So why not try it out? Go to our website, pensioncraft.com/membership to learn more.
Okay, for all this talk of money doesn't necessarily make you happy, focus on your goals, maybe you've got enough. Let's do the dumb question. How much do I need to be rich?
Well, here you'd look at percentiles, you look at distributions to see what the wealth of the most wealthy households would be. And based on the latest data from the Office for National Statistics, the wealthiest 10% of households had a wealth of about 1.2 million. So that's a household wealth value for the entire household, and it includes everything. It includes the value of the house, physical assets, financial assets, and pensions.
So yeah, to get into the top 10%, you need at least 1.2 million. This was of March 2022, by the way. These figures have a lag. To get into the wealthiest 1%, you need £3,121,000 in the UK. And what I found interesting was that the breakdown of that wealth, what assets it's held in, does vary significantly between the different deciles. So the typical family in the top 1% would have property worth 1.4 million, pensions worth another 1.4 million roughly, financial assets of 600 odd thousand, and physical assets of around 200,000. But then if you go down the deciles, what seems to happen is property gets less valuable slowly, pensions get less valuable, but financial wealth just decreases very quickly. That's held largely by the top 10%.
Now, this explains why there's been such an increase in wealth inequality when interest rates fell, because that hugely boosted property values and stock market values. And financial wealth and property wealth both got a boost. So it was very much helping those who were already quite wealthy and disadvantaged those who weren't, certainly in terms of total wealth.
The other thing to note is that obviously household wealth varies significantly by age. So the ONS has figures where they look at who's the head of the household and how old are they, and then how much wealth does that household have. So the median household wealth gradually increases with age from just £15,000 for those under 24 years of age to a peak of around £500,000 for households who are in their 60s. And then it actually starts to decrease after state pension age as obviously people start spending down their pots.
So no big surprises there. You build up wealth over the course of your life and then you spend it.
The question, I guess, is, will today's youngsters build up wealth to the same extent that previous generations did?
I certainly like to think that's possible. If you listen to some of the things that are said, it sounds like it's much more difficult. Certainly talking to the next generation in our family, they're finding it very difficult to get onto the property ladder. Perhaps it's because we live in Buckinghamshire and so property's ridiculously expensive.
Oh no, if you look at the stats, I'm pretty sure that home ownership among younger people in their 20s has declined and the average age of buying a first property has increased. And that's largely happened, I think, over the last couple of decades.
But I think if you go back further, home ownership was really rare. So we're talking here about a century back in time. So perhaps what we're actually looking at is a period when we're just reverting to the norm a little bit.
Yeah, I think overall home ownership rates haven't decreased that much at all. It's just a skew between different generations. The other thing is obviously current workers typically don't benefit from defined benefit pensions, which if you look at equalising them with defined contribution schemes, defined benefit pensions tend to have been worth a lot more. And who knows if we'll achieve the same return on assets over time. There was that period in the 90s where property prices, particularly in London and the southeast, just went crazy. Like the growth rate was incredible. And that's, I guess, why older people today have this vision in the UK that the way to get rich is to buy property, which hasn't been true since the financial crisis. But it's still that myth kind of lives on.
But I think you can be proactive about it. So personally, I believe that equity wealth will carry on paying out. But that is ultimately a belief. There's no theoretical reason why equity prices will continue to grow at comparable rates as they did in the past.
I'm just grateful we can invest beyond our own shores, right? That does provide a lot of diversification, I think.
Yeah, and that'll probably benefit a lot of people. Plus, I think auto-enrollment has been one of the most positive changes ever in the UK. More people are forced effectively to save for the future.
But even then, the latest government figures show most people will have a shortfall in retirement because auto-enrollment, it doesn't actually compel you to set aside that much money. Better than nothing, of course. But on its own, it's probably not enough.
But that brings us back onto the main topic of the podcast, which is it's good to know what your numbers are. And if you're aware of the numbers, then you can probably do something about it. And that's true from whatever point you are in life in terms of saving.
But what I would say is that the dumb question, how much do I need to be rich? Or if you're looking at the top 1%, we said it's over 3 million in the UK. It's very hard and I think unusual to get there these days as a person who doesn't come from wealth already, who doesn't inherit, who doesn't marry into wealth. Building up 3 million requires you probably to step outside the typical path of a career.
Yeah, normally would require setting up a business, and that's a big risk. It requires capital, and if you haven't got capital to start, that's much more difficult, I think.
Thank you for joining us for Many Happy Returns. Keep sending us your questions, no matter how dumb, at mhr@pensioncraft.com.
And do remember to check out pensioncraft.com for all the information about our membership, courses, and investment coaching options.
Many Happy Returns is a PensionCraft production, co-hosted and executive produced by Roman Nakiza and Michael Pugh. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes and is not financial advice. We do not provide recommendations or endorse any decision to buy, sell, or hold any security. We cannot be held responsible for any actions listeners may take, and investors are encouraged to seek independent financial advice.